My name is Stan Tennant, and I appreciate you all coming. And I'm a little intimidated because I haven't basically given this presentation for a general audience before. And so we'll see what happens. There are a few things that I want to say first before starting. This is work in progress, and although we're pretty sure we're onto something here, I don't think it would be useful to assume that everything I say is true, because I'm sure there are parts that aren't correct. And that before we can make claims that are perhaps as wide-reaching as these ideas need to be reviewed. They have to pass peer review both in the academic communities and in the religious communities before they're going to be acceptable. And until we've done certain tests that we haven't done, at least not to my satisfaction, we're not ready to do that. So I would prefer if people consider this all speculation. And I'm going to speak quickly because that's what I do. And I'm going to say is when I mean maybe, and like that. So assume when I make strong statements that they really are subject to being tested in some cases. But see for yourself. The basic idea here is that many people have said recently, and I guess over the ages, that there ought to be, or there is, or there should be, or maybe there has been, a relationship between physics and consciousness, and metaphysics, if you will. And that's what I think we found here. This is a more akin to a discovery. This isn't an invention. If I'm right, I didn't make any of this up. To the extent I made it up, it's probably not right. But I believe that this represents a philosophy, a basic underpinning of the philosophy of many cultures in the ancient world and even into modern times. I want to start by putting some context on this, and there's a quotation that I came upon in a book on quantum mechanics for the public called Quantum Reality by Nick Herbert, where at the very end of the book he's getting to the point about why he's interested in physics, which is his field. And he says that he believes one of the greatest scientific achievements imaginable would be the discovery of an explicit relationship between the waveform alphabets of quantum theory and certain human states of consciousness. Now, he didn't really mean an ordinary alphabet when he says alphabets of quantum theory, but in a sense, he does. And I think that's what we really have here. I think that the ancient world, the Greek world, perhaps even earlier, the Hebrew world, later the Muslim world, the cultures that have made claims that their alphabets are sacred, are special, and that their alphabets are the alphabets of creation or reality or other special status. People making those claims in all these cultures, and those claims are made for Hebrew and Greek and Arabic and Sanskrit and some of the Tibetan alphabets and many others, that people who make these claims should be taken seriously. Yes, there are people who make claims like that, and it's just religious puffery, or it's just sort of a poetic license. Well, our alphabet is special, we're going to call it sacred. But many of the people who made these claims have well-established track records. The rabbis, the Greek mathematicians all have other works that they've demonstrated their competence in, and I think it makes sense to take what they said seriously. So that's basically what we're going to look at here. The question first arises is, how can a letter be an element of creation? These alphabets are sacred. I put the Hebrew letter B on the blackboard. This is its printed form, and this is its script form. I'm just going to leave them there. The question does come up. How can a letter, I just drew a letter on the black, how can that be an element of creation? What meaning can that have? Think about it. I want to tell you about the letter B, though, because it's the beginning of the story anyhow. It's the first letter of, I need a pointer for some of this, everywhere. It's right down here. This is the first verse of the text of Genesis in Hebrew. Normally translated, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The first letter is the letter B. And the letter B in Hebrew, its name is Beit, means house. means archetypal container, the distinction between inside and outside. That's the first thing that happens in the life of a child. When a child is born, the first thing that happens is the child has to breathe in and out, and that's an unconscious action. And then a little later, the child has to eat. And in order to eat, it has to distinguish between inside, where the food goes, and outside, where it comes from. So the first element of our consciousness is the distinction between inside or outside. Also, there's an understanding of that relates to physics and to metaphysics, which we'll get to. I wanted to leave that on the table. Now, I wanted to start off, and I'll have to ask your indulgence, by reading some quotations. And the reason I'm going to read these quotations is because they contain ideas that are not commonly known, and that most Jews and Christians, I don't know if we have any Muslims here, but basically most people who know about the Bible, know about religious ideas, don't know this. And many people violently reject what I'm going to read. What I'm going to read is, I'll give you the references. These are mostly rabbinic references, but I go a little farther afield than that. So let me just read them to give you a sense of some possibilities here, because I'm going to be playing with the letters of the text of Genesis. And the question is, what right do I have to do that? Doesn't everyone know what the text of Genesis says? Hasn't it been translated often enough by now? And the answer is maybe too often. First quote is quoted in Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's book, The Light Beyond, Adventures in Hasidic Thought, and it's attributed to Rabbi Yehoshua Avram of Zitmar. And he says, "Our sages teach us that the Torah was created 2,000 years before the world. This is difficult to understand, since the Torah contains accounts of many events that happened after creation. How can the Torah speak of creation, Adam and Eve, Noah, the holy patriarchs, and all the other things recorded in the Torah? All these things had not yet happened when the Torah was written." And then he explains, "Actually, when the Torah was first created, it was a mixture of letters. The letters of the Torah were not yet combined into words as they are now. Whenever anything then happened in the world, these letters were combined and the words were recombined to form the account. This was true of the account of creation, the story of Adam and Eve. The letters combined with each other, forming the words that told this story. Similarly, when an individual died, a combination of letters was formed saying that he died. The same was true of the rest of the Torah. As soon as an event that was to be recorded in Torah took place, a combination was immediately formed corresponding to that event. If a different event had taken place, the letters would have combined differently." Interesting idea. A further comment by another rabbi, this is Rabbi Levi Yitzhak, also quoted by Kaplan. "In its sequence of descent into this lowly world, the Torah must become clothed in a material garment, which often consists of stories." And these are the stories that have been translated, of course. "When God grants a person knowledge, understanding, and intelligence, uncovering the mask that blinds his eyes, he can see the wonders of God's Torah. The people on this level are few, however, and the majority only understand the Torah according to its simple meaning." The creationists are not going to like what I'm going to be presenting here today, because I'm not talking about the story in Genesis at all, although we'll see why the story does have some relevance. It's basically a simple metaphor for the deeper metaphor. And here's another fellow makes even a stronger statement. This is in the Zohar, and it's quoted by Louis Ginsberg. And it says, the Zohar is one of the chief Kabbalistic books. It says, "Woe unto the man who asserts that this Torah intends to relate only commonplace things and secular narratives. For if this were so, then in the present times likewise the Torah might be written with more attractive narratives. Now the narratives of the Torah are its garments. He who thinks that these garments are the Torah itself deserves to perish and have no share in the world to come. Woe unto the fools who look no further when they see an elegant robe. More valuable than the garment is the body which carries it, and more valuable even than that is the soul which animates the body. Fools see only the garment of the Torah, the more intelligent see the body, the wise see the soul, its proper being, and in the Messianic time, the upper soul of the Torah will stand revealed." The idea is that we're not looking at just a sequence of stories. Now now that we know that this isn't just a set of stories, what is it? And I have a couple of other quotes that give us some sense as to what might be going on here. This is from Carlos Suarez, who is a Kabbalist, died a few years ago. This is from his Cipher of Genesis. And he says, "In the severity of its beginning, in its first chapter, in its first verse, in its first sequence of letter numbers," All of a sudden, these are no longer just letters, they're letter numbers. Is the seed, and in the seed is the whole. This whole can be, and is expected to be, grasped in the Beit Resh Aleph Shin Yod Tav of Bereshit. That's the first word there. This sequence is the revelation, is in the revelation, and those who grasp it are in the revelation and are, in action, the revelation itself. What he's saying is that there's some sort of a secret, some sort of a numerical, mathematical, some kind of a coding in the sequence of letters that make up the text, and that they represent the revelation, the deep meaning of the text. And what the other rabbis were saying, and this is knowledge that would have been known in early Christian times too. These aren't recent understanding. This is recent quotes, maybe 1,000 years old, but they're not. This isn't new ideas in Judaism. So this is true in the Christian world too, although I doubt many Christians or Jews know about it. The text itself is kind of like, it's like a source, a plenum, in the physicist world, it'd be like a manifold of potential possibilities. And then when an event happens, the letters are grouped together and vowelization is added so that there's a story meaning that comes out that corresponds to the history. At least that's what the rabbis are saying. You have to know about Hebrew to understand that there aren't any vowels in Hebrew. The letters, the alphabet is up on top here. All of these letters have consonantal value as consonants. The vowels are little notations that are added, and I don't think there's any vowels at all. I don't think I even drew any vowels. No. The vowels are little symbols that are placed either below or above the letters, and they have vocalization. Also, the original texts, as I've drawn it here, aren't broken up into words. How you break up the text into words and what vowelization you put on the clusters of letters gives you a great range, a great freedom in what story it ends up saying. So I wanted to leave you with a sense that there's room for there to be more here than a story. And then the question is, well, what is it? Let me tell you what Meru is, why we're calling our foundation Meru Foundation, and what the Meru Project is. The word Meru has meaning in many different cultures and languages. Most of you may have heard of it as the name of the world mountain that exists in the midst of the land of Shambhala, where one incarnates in the Eastern traditions. If one is sufficiently advanced, that one's not going to fall back. And so you climb Mount Meru to get to Shambhala. And Shambhala sits in the middle of, Meru sits in the middle of Shambhala. World mountain. So it's like Mount Olympus or any other world mountain. It also turns out in Indian tradition to be the name of the Pascal triangle. Now the Pascal triangle is an unfoldment of numbers that are like the golden mean proportion. They all sort of add one to another. And they mimic the growth of all living things. The sequence of numbers, the Fibonacci series, the Pascal triangle, the golden mean proportion, that's the unfoldment proportion for the geometry of all living things. And that mountain, that unfoldment is called Mount Meru. It's an interesting connection. The name of the Hebrew alphabet is Meruba. And the Meru part refers to as I will show you, to the vortex shape. And the Ba in Hebrew, from the letter Beit, means box, means container of, means in it. So we have some sort of a vortex in a box. Now the word Meruba, to ordinary discussion, is said to derive from the word arba'ah in Hebrew, which means fourfold, which means four. So Meruba would mean fourfold. If you think of the fourfold, if you're thinking flat, which is, I'll have to erase my little Beit here to get a little room. If you're thinking of the fourfold and it's flat, then it's a square, which is what most people believe the Meruba, the arba'ah, refers to, in the name of the Hebrew alphabet. Because the letters are kind of square-shaped. The letters on the very top, they're kind of square. But if you're thinking in 3 dimensions, which is a much more accurate model of our world, then the object that looks square, that's fourfold, is the tetrahedron. It looks like a square if you hold it just so. And so if you were to draw it on a piece of paper, and then the Inquisition would have come along and kill you off, which happens periodically, your successor who tried to interpret your drawings would misidentify what you had drawn. And one of the reasons why I believe what I've got up here hasn't been known for a long time is because that's exactly what happened. The Inquisition rolled through periodically, the generic Inquisition, if you will, for the last several thousand years. And notations and drawings were drawn flat, and were soon to be flat when they were rediscovered. But they should have been drawn 3-dimensionally. and if they did represent three-dimensional objects, then the text that accompanied the drawings would make sense instead of read like poetry only, which is often how they're translated. The root mer itself in the Romance languages refers to the sea. I think that comes from its basis in wave motion, this vorticular motion. There's also another form of Mount Meru, and that is in the Eastern tradition there is a very famous mandala, the Mandala Creation, the Sri Yantra, and it is supposed to exist in a Meru form, which is shown to be a set of stacked plates. In fact, the transformations that I'm going to show you on the Hebrew text also work on the Eastern tradition, and if one takes the flat Meru mandala and pulls it out in 3 dimensions, you can see the same mandala, and if you look straight at me as I scan around. And then one can see the real structure of why there would be a mountain called Meru. And we'll hopefully get to some opportunity to play with that. I also have a little model here that lights up we can play with later. All right, that will serve as a sort of introduction. Let me show you what I did and what I found, and then let's talk about the significance of it, which is probably the greater part of the discussion. I think the easiest way to tell you how this all came about is to tell it to you historically. I was sitting in my apartment in Newton, Massachusetts in 1968, and I had this urge to look at the beginning of Genesis in Hebrew, which was a strange urge considering the fact that I didn't read Hebrew, although I did know the alphabet. Now, I have one talent in this world, and that is I'm a visual pattern recognizer, as maybe has become evident already. And my eyes fell on the letters, and I could not get it out of my head that there was something peculiar about the sequence of letters. It just didn't look like language to me. Since I couldn't read it, that was a further reason why it didn't look like language. If it had looked like language, if I had been a good student in my earlier days and had learned to read Hebrew, I would have, just like you pick up a piece of paper in any language, you don't start counting letters and look at letter patterns, you simply read what's said there, and I never would have seen this. So I asked around, assuming that Genesis was the most heavily researched document going, and people told me they didn't know what I was talking about. I asked a rabbi, I asked a priest, I went over to MIT, I went over to Harvard, nothing. Eventually people told me this must be Kabbalah, it must be Hebrew mysticism. Well, I'd never heard of Kabbalah, so I decided I'd better get educated if I was going to figure out what was going on here. And I realized that if no one knew about this, and there really was some kind of coding in the letters of the text of Genesis, then this could be very important. And we'll see why that may be. So I read just about everything I could find in English on Kabbalah. I read Hebrew material, I read Christian material, I read Arabic material, I read Greek material, the Pythagorean mysticism, I read some Eastern material. I read stuff printed in green ink from people who'd been up in flying saucers. I read stuff written by very conservative rabbis who really didn't like to write anything down at all and say as little as possible. And I started to put together a sense that even though I couldn't figure out what they were talking about, it was very nice poetry, and yes, there might very well be meditations involved. The literary criticism methods that the academic scholars used to make sense of Kabbalistic texts didn't do much for me. Yes, I could see you compare this sentence to that sentence, but that didn't tell me anything about what the author was saying. It just told me he was saying the same thing here as here. And eventually, after 10 years, I started to build up a sense that these Kabbalistic texts were talking about something. There was just too many details for it to be pulled out of the air. There was just too much commonality these texts to be the individual experiences of mystics. There was something that bound it all together, and it didn't matter if I was reading Rosicrucian material or reading Sanskrit material in English translation, or Hebrew material. It all seemed to have the same underpinning. And many others have claimed this too. There are numerous teachers over the centuries who claim the same thing. But I wasn't satisfied by them simply telling me it was all the same. It didn't look the same, it just felt the same. So the idea was to find out what was going on. Well, what did I do? I didn't know what to do. It was really rather confusing. I had the first verse of Genesis here. If I use the names of letters, I'll use the English equivalent letter names, because I think everyone will know them, and not everyone will know the Hebrew or the Greek names. And they're all in parallel, at least almost all of them. Towards the end of the alphabet, there have been some substitutions. So bet in Hebrew is our letter B, is beta in Greek. And resh in Hebrew is our letter R, is the Greek letter rho. And it's completely parallel through the text, through all of the alphabet. And that's because they use these alphabets as counting systems. And they're all out in the same alphabetical order, and A was always 1, and B was always 2. And you counted through the alphabet, and you have this numerological gematria system, which most people think that's what's going on in the Kabbalistic material. It's just a bunch of number mysticism. Well, that wasn't very convincing to me. And I looked and looked and looked at this first verse, and I couldn't figure out what to do with it. But I kept remembering what Suarez had said. And I read other places also. And the idea is that the secret of the universe is supposed to be in the first letter. But if you're not bright enough to figure it out from the first letter, God in his infinite mercy repeats it in greater detail in the first word. If you can't figure it out from the first word, oh, well, don't worry. God repeats it in the first verse. It's a description of a hierarchical array. Now, I don't know about you, but it wasn't obvious to me right off that that letter, how that meant the secret of the universe. That just didn't do it for me. And the first word, that would have been nice, except I didn't know what the first word was. I mean, it's fine. Most people translate that first word, that is the first word, bereshit. It means in, and the word rosh, resh, and head refers to the head. The word in Hebrew means a head. And so it means in, at the head of, in the beginning. But there's no reason to take that as the first word. The letters weren't broken up into words. Here's another sequence of B, R, and A, just like here, except this sequence is translated, he created. And this little three-letter sequence has a meaning. It means, for instance, 6, or it means a thorn. And it means many other things, too. There's actually over 900 official Talmudic translations to the first verse alone. So there's a little flexibility in the meaning here. But it seemed to me that I didn't know what the first word was. Now, the first verse, that I could look at. It was long enough for me to play with, short enough for me to look at, long enough to have enough information, and the first word of the next verse repeats the last word of the first verse. So even if this wasn't a natural unit, there's a fold point here. There's a reason to believe that I can stop at this point and examine. What am I going to examine? Not much you can do with that. Well, over the 10 years, I had drawn up a set of criteria of what I was looking for if there was going to be anything and if it was going to be findable. And I made a simple analogy with something that was current at the time I was doing this. It must be about 15 years ago now that the folks at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory decided to send a message into outer space by the radio telescope in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. And they devised a binary code that made a little black and white TV picture of a man and the elements of life and a little picture of DNA and of the solar system. It was a black and white TV picture. And the reason they did that is because they deduced that folks living on Alpha Centauri or other star systems someplace in the universe who might receive our message weren't likely to speak English or Sanskrit or Swahili or any other Earth language. That whatever message they were going to send over several thousand years of space-time had to be in some kind of a universal form. It had to be decipherable by whoever got it, no matter what their idea of language was. And the key for breaking into it had to be given, had to be there right up front, had to be very obvious. And so they designed in their little TV picture the kind of qualities they thought would enable someone to independently rediscover their TV picture. Well, it occurred to me that 2,000 years of space-time is hardly any different than 2,000 years of Earth time. That over a course of 2,000 or 3,000 years, which is the supposed history of these texts, language becomes dead, becomes lost. Meanings change. It's hard for us to read Shakespearean English at this point. We can still do it, but it's difficult. Hebrew became a dead language during the Babylonian exile and was only reconstituted by Ezra at about 500 BC. The Hebrew that Israelis speak today was made up about 100 years ago by a guy named Yehuda Ben Yehuda. I forget his first name. So that there wasn't any necessary link between what happened 3,000 years ago and now. And besides, the people 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, if they had something of extreme importance that they wanted to preserve, they couldn't assume that their language would survive. So if there was something recoverable, and it was really important, and the people who knew it or had it at the time wanted it to be recoverable, they would have had to have provided for it to be self-decoding. And that was one of my original criteria. There had to be a key, a crypto marker, a way to break into the system, if there was a system, and it had to be throughout the text, and it had to be especially at the beginning. The beginning might not survive, so you have to have it throughout the text as well. Well, I decided to look for such a way to break into the system. It took me several years. I didn't know what to do. But I did hear another legend, which was very interesting. I've got it up on top here. The Hebrew alphabet that Ezra came up with is this alphabet up on top, so-called Meruba, square form, Aramaic style alphabet. It has 27 letters in groups, 3 groups of 9. But Ezra did something, at least Ezra was supposed to have done something. According to the rabbinic tradition, he restored the original form of the letters. According to the academic scholars, he adopted the Aramaic letters and added 5 letters at the end of the alphabet, which are final forms of earlier letters. If you want to make an M in the middle of the alphabet, you draw it that way. If it's the last letter of a word, you draw it that way. Well, if you start to insert final letters into the text, you start to define word divisions all of a sudden. So you start to be able to break the text up. And the thing about this alphabet is, as the Christians have taught, and as the Jews teach, and I don't know if Muslims teach the same thing, to change a jot or a tittle of these sacred texts would be disastrous, would be a terrible heresy, might mean the end of the world. If the Torah is, as the Jews teach, the template of creation, the pattern that God looked into to create the world, if you change a letter, then you change the creation. And so rabbis who believe this certainly weren't going to change any letters. But on the other hand, we're told that Ezra changed the whole alphabet from the Canaanite alphabet and added 5 final letter forms and rewrote all of the texts. Slightly inconsistent story. Well, the important part is that the 27 letters is not an arbitrary number of letters. It's an explicit number. And it finally dawned on me that the first verse of Genesis had a string of 27 letters followed by the 27th letter. 28 letters altogether. 27 letters, the 27th letter, and a 27-letter alphabet that comes along with it. 3 statements of 27. And 27 is 3 cubed. I said to myself, gee, I wonder what would happen if I counted the letters out in base 3, by 3s. Well, I ultimately tried other bases also, but when I counted by 3s, interesting things started to happen. And what I did is I simply started with the aleph as 0, not as 1 like the numerologists do, because I'm going to be looking at a geometric system, not a system of arithmetic. And the first count geometrically is the origin, the reference point. And the aleph, as you can see, is a funny shape. It has this diagonal swath down the middle. And as I realized later, an aleph is really nothing but the head and tail of the snake that eats its tail, the Ouroboros, which is another name for the Hebrew alphabet. If you connect the second letter to the last letter upside down as if it came around under it, then you have a little aleph. And so another reason for considering it to be the splice point, the odd letter, the 0 count. And so I count from 0 to 26, and I count by 3s. 0, 1, 2, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 0, 2, 1, 2, 2. It's just like counting by 2s or by 10s as we normally do. After you get up to 2, you have to carry, because in base 3, 3 is the base, that's the power that you carry by. When you do that, you get a little digit, a little number associated with each letter, which is really nothing but its position in the alphabet. In other words, this letter, K, says the 10th letter, starting with aleph is 0, and 10 in base 3 is written 1, 0, 1. Very simple. Well, and then finally, again, after many months of staring off into space, it occurred to me that I could use those same little numbers that are the position of the letters in the alphabet and consider them to be Cartesian coordinates. And so I ended up putting the letters of the alphabet on this nice little model that Dr. Rubik was kind enough to make for us all. And they're simply in the same order as it says there. If the letter is say, the letter H, 021, I took that to be at the location on an X, Y, Z coordinate system to 0, 2, 1. X equals 0, Y equals 2, Z equals 1. And so I'm out over here. And so every letter gets a location given by its Cartesian coordinate, given by its letter count, its position in the alphabet. And that means that the alphabet stacks up in 3 layers, just like it does according to traditional teachings, except now the letters are on this symmetrical object. Kind of interesting. And then I noticed something else that was very strange. Again, this was the hardest part, and I must have spent, it was several weeks just staring at this stuff, scratching my head, saying, what can I possibly do to compare that alphabet to that verse? Well, I finally was reduced to blithering idiot status, which is the proper humble position for learning anything. After trying all the tricks of set theory and all kinds of permutations and wild charts and graphs and this and that, I was reduced to blithering idiot status, and I merely decided to check off on the cube the letters that were used in the first verse and cut away the rest of the cube and see what I had left. So I did that. I took a cube. Now in this case it's just the points, not little cubelets. And I checked off the letters that occurred in the first verse, and I cut away the letters that didn't occur. And I was left with this object. And I was very surprised, because it had no right to be symmetrical, and yet it was. Now, that could be by just coincidence, could be random. A statistician friend over at UC Berkeley a few weeks ago said that he did some quick test, and he thought maybe 1 time in 100, if you did what I did, you'd get a symmetrical object. It's not a hard and fast rule, but that's a nice number. So it might have meant something. I didn't know what. But then I noticed something really extraordinary. I noticed that in this first verse, some letters occurred once, some letters occurred twice, some letters occurred 3 times, and the aleph, the letter A, occurred 6 times, and that's all. There aren't any letters that occur 4 times. There aren't any letters that occur 5 times. And then I noticed that the letters that occurred, and I'm only going to be looking at the first 27, I'm not looking at that last letter because I'm comparing 27 to 27. The letters that occurred an even number of times in the first verse are all on the axis of symmetry. And the letters that occurred once are opposite the letters that occur 3 times. There are 3 of these R's. 1, 2, 3, and 1 L. 3 R's and 1 L. There are 3 T's and 1 F. There are 3 E's and 1 M. That's kind of strange. And so I decided, just to see what would happen, to look at R's and L's and T's and F's and E's and M's and the others that are in symmetrical positions as if they were related to each other somehow. Just because I was curious. I was desperate, that's what I was. I was really hoping to find something. And of course, when I did that, it got interesting very quickly. Because what I found is that every group of letters that were in symmetrical positions, now you don't have to have a cube to know they're in symmetrical positions, because the way the Cartesian coordinate system works, you get mirror image coordinates. The 201 letter is in symmetrical position to the 102 letter. And if a letter is self-symmetric, it'll have a symmetrical count, such as 202 or 212. And it'll be on the axis of symmetry, which is the main diagonal of the cube, diagonal plane of the cube. In the packets we have, that is a template for making your own cubes, for those of you who want to pick those up later. Well, let's see what happens. I have an R, I have another R, then I get my first L, then I get an R. R, R, L, R. Well, let's look at the T's and the F's. I get a T, I get another T, I get an F, then I get a T. T, T, F, T. Gee, that's strange. That's the same order. E, E, M, E. You mean they were all going to do that? Yeah. As a matter of fact, if you go through the text, the first time a letter is used in any verse, in the same verse, a letter on the symmetrical side of the cube is used. Now that's too often to be, there's one exception, by the way, and that exception turns out to be even more interesting. By the way, the Y's the I's and the B's are reversed. It's I, B, I, because this initial B pairs with this final tzadi, final Z, to make this spin axis, which I'll show you later. And this is kind of a reverse handoff to the next sentence. And so the pattern's the same, but it's turned upside down because it's hooking to the other thing. It's sort of a reverse thing. Keeps flipping on itself. We'll see a little more about how that fits together later. But here's the interesting thing. You know, if you look for 20 years, and you're reasonably clever, you're going to find patterns. There's no big deal to finding patterns. The question isn't whether you can find patterns. The question is whether they have any meaning. If you introduce an idea and it has nothing to do with what you're doing, you won't get any new information out by using that idea. You know, if you're trying to listen to the hi-fi, you turn the light on in the room, it doesn't change the sound, for most people. Well, you know, you can't be sure these days. But if you do something, and when you turn that crank, you use that little tool, all kinds of things happen, and they're interesting things, and you start to get a sense of what you're doing, you get more out than you put in, then you have a right to suspect strongly that what you did had something to do with what you did it to. When I shine the light of base 3 on the text, all of a sudden I start to get patterns. The only thing you can tell about this pattern is, one, it certainly isn't a coincidence. And in fact, researchers at UCLA and at Bar-Ilan University in Israel and at Technion in Haifa, Israel, have done statistical tests on the text. They hadn't done it when I first did this, but they have now. And there's no question that there's letter-level coding throughout the 5 books of Moses. They've also found some coding in the Gospels, but because these are Jews doing the work, Orthodox Jews, they don't want to talk about that in public. So if there are any Christians out here who don't know about the Gospels, you'll have to do the work for yourself, because the rabbis won't do it for you. Well, one thing does come of this. When I use base 3 to count out the letters, the whole first verse becomes one unit. There aren't any letters left over. Everything has its place. Well, what can I do? I still can't identify what that looks like. There's another teaching, a rabbinic teaching. And the teaching is that the Torah is eternal. The Torah is unique. It's not just a bunch of stories. It's not like anything else, not even like anything else sacred in Judaism, such as the Talmud, which is extremely important, the basis of Jewish practices in the Talmud. But the Torah can't even be compared to the Talmud. That would be sacrilege. Torah is so unique, it can only be compared to itself. So I decided to compare it to itself. Seemed reasonable. How do you compare a text to itself? Well, now are we back to literary criticism? Should I look at the first story in Genesis of the creation and the second and compare how they differ? Well, that's already been done. It wasn't very satisfying. And besides, it didn't give me anything new to work with. I'm looking at the letters. So I said, what would happen if I compared the letters to themselves? And that's what I did. You know how you make a paper doll or a paper airplane? Take a piece of paper, and you stick tab A into slot A, and then you put tab B into slot B, and tab C into slot C. You autocorrelate it. You correlate it with itself. Tab A with slot A, tab B with slot B. And the piece of paper folds up, hopefully, into the model it was intended to make. And so I decided to fold up this string of letters in such a way that letters that were the same were going to be next to each other. And if I couldn't find letters that were the same, I was going to allow myself one other piece of freedom. I was going to allow myself to choose letters that were in symmetrical positions on my cube. Now, ultimately, I did things a little more complicated than that yet, but I don't think we have time to go into those details, and besides, they're not relevant to the first verse. Well, how do you do that? What I did is I took myself a piece of paper and I wrote the text out on it. Actually, I took a piece of really backgammon chips on the tabletop. But the easiest way to see this is to think of these letters as on a string, as little pearls on a string that you can push around. And then I curled the string up such that the same letters came into relationship with each other. And here it is. You start over here, it's the first letter, and you go around following this little curve, this little coil. These first 3 letters line up with their recurrence. That's these 3 and these 3. They line up together. There's another sequence of 3. A-T-E, A-T-E. Well, they're up here. And likewise with all the others. You'll notice that either the same letters are paired with each other or letters that are base 3 reciprocals on the cube in mirror image positions. And when you do that, the whole first verse lines up with itself. Letters that are colored the same are either the same letters or in the same symmetry group. And what you'll notice about that pattern is it's extremely symmetrical. All the letters are accounted for. And it's such a strong pattern that if any one letter were to have been lost or mistranscribed over the centuries, it could be uniquely replaced or corrected by reference only to the other letters in the same verse. And that's true as you go through the text. Approximately one letter can be corrected for each verse. At least that's my guess at this point. The presence of an error-correcting pattern is tantamount to a demonstration that there's information. It's real hard to correct something that doesn't have any meaning. It's just don't go anyplace doing that. Well, what is this? Well, first, the reason I started it here rather than on the edge someplace is because I realized this was on the surface of a donut, which one could pull through. And I didn't want these lines to cross over in funny ways, so I simply rotated it through itself. But if it were on the surface of a donut, then that would all work as one unit. And so that's what the first verse of Genesis draws. It draws a kind of donut called a two-torus, a two-dimensional surface on a torus. As a matter of fact, one can curl it up like this. Now remember, when you get up to the top here, it's as if you went through and started out at the bottom again. This is as if this is on the surface of a donut. I made it look like a Cheops pyramid for a couple of reasons. If you have a cyclical pattern and it has 8-fold symmetry and 7 turns, then there's a measure angle that goes along with a function like that in mathematics called the Argon pole angle. And it turns out to be I think it's the 8th root of 7, might be the 7th root of 8, I forget now. And that turned out to be the tangent of the Cheops pyramid angle. Cheops pyramid, by the way, is also called mirror. And before the Muslims took the casing stones off to build the Mosque of Cairo about 700 or 800 years ago, there were supposed to have been 7 colored bands with writing painted on them on the side of the pyramid. No one knows what that looked like. But that's kind of suspicious. Now there's seven bands there, and that's kind of interesting because 7's a real important number in the religious world, but in the mathematical world it's important too. Donuts intrinsically have 7 colored regions on them. Turns out that if you want to make a map and you want adjacent countries to be different colors, and you make your map on the surface of a table or a sphere, then you only need 4 different colors so that the adjacent countries are different colors. If it's on a Mobius strip, a band with a half twist in it, you need 6 colors. On a donut, you need 7 colors. You never need more, you can't get by with less. And they're always on the same 3-turn spiral. And we can go into some more detail on that, maybe that later if we have a chance. But you can think of a donut as 7 regions, 7 little vectors chasing each other head to tail in a cycle. And they go around 3 times. They actually go through once, so you might want to call it 4 times, but there's no standard way to count that. So we've now identified the first verse of Genesis. It folds itself up into a donut. This is the bagel theory of reality. Second verse is more complex. It also fits the same form, but it's a lot longer, and I couldn't sketch it without making a terribly complicated drawing, so I left it out. But in case you're wondering, third verse does the same thing. It's the third verse where God says, "Let there be light," and so it's appropriate to make a candlestick, a menorah, 7-branch candlestick. Now that's looking down the coil. Here we're looking down the coil this way, but here I've arranged it so it sort of laps on itself as you go around. And again, notice all the letters pair up. This one's an odd letter, but it's symmetrical with this other 2 that are in the same set. And in most cases, the letters are completely doubled up. And I have looked further into the text. The patterns get complicated very quickly, but there is evidence of that this kind of coding continues also. But this isn't the densest pattern I could make. And why do I want a denser pattern? Well, let's go back and get a little context here. We're told that Hebrew, according to the Hebrew tradition, was a universal language before the Tower of Babel, that somehow there was an understanding of it that was universal. If you're going to do something that's universal, you have to pick the unique case in every instance. If there's more than one way to do something, then it's not going to be universal unless there's a clear choice. The choice that Mother Nature makes, that we've observed in doing our science, is to take the most compact, the most elegant, the lowest order. It's called Occam's razor. The idea is you don't want it to make a more complicated theory than you need to. And Mother Nature doesn't do that either. Nothing is wasted. This pattern has a lot of missing places where there aren't any letters. In other words, if it's eightfold symmetry, 8 poles and 7 turns, there can be 56 letters on there, 56 beads. I'm only using 28 beads, so I'm only using half the spaces. And even though this is sort of three-dimensional now, it's really still on a surface. It's still kind of a flattish thing. And we live in a three-dimensional reality. So the idea would be maybe there's a more compact form of that first verse that might eliminate some of those empty spaces, that might be a higher dimensional figure. And there is. Let's see if I can find it. Put it here somewhere. There it is up on top. Here it is over here. If you were to arrange the first verse on a cube with a vortex on each face of the cube, actually, you just follow it around, letters are all, and it actually starts here and comes up this way. You'd find that opposite vortexes are mirror images of each other. Now, there are still 4 spaces that are empty. That simply implies, if this is going to hold up, that this is really a higher dimensional object, and we're just still looking at if this is the 3-dimensional form. Maybe there's a 4-dimensional form which drops out those last 4 spaces.
How many letters in that first verse?
28 letters in the first verse, 27 followed by the 27th letter. Well, that means that that first verse folds up into this object. This is supposed to be a representation of that. There's more than one way one can assemble it. In fact, it turns out this is also a donut. It doesn't look like a donut. Let me show you why it's a donut. The way you make a normal donut is you take a piece of paper, a square, typically, maybe it's a square, and you connect the left edge to the right edge, and then you have a tube, and you connect the top to the bottom, and you would make a donut, except I'll wrinkle my paper if I did it. That makes a donut in 3 dimensions, called a 2-torus. If you wanted to make a donut in 4 dimensions, you could take a cube and arrange it so as to connect this face to this, and this face to this, and this face to that. And that would be a donut in 4 dimensions, which we can't see except as shadows. So these are shadows. Well, that's how this is arranged. If you look through it, this vortex is the opposite of that one. It's as if this was brought around and pasted onto here. And this one is pasted onto there, and that's the projective space of a donut in 4 dimensions. And there's more than one projection of it. Here are 2. These are made of the same pieces, but connected up slightly differently. And that's the way one looks. This is the way the other one looks. Put that back in the holder. We're going to get back to those in a minute when we talk about what these all represent. So what have I found? I found that the first verse of Genesis folds up into this flower. Maybe I should tell you what it is. One could call this a menorah. It's got a center point which seems to light 6 little vortices, which look like flames. The little vortex looks like a flame. Where did the vortex come from? Oh, well, you just peel the 7-color map off of the donut, and you have a little vortex. This is the definition of the donut. You don't need the rest of the donut. Mathematicians don't need the dough. They just want to know what the surface is, you know, how it all fits together. Donuts is not good. We'll get back to what that means in a minute. Well, let me just bring it down to the result now, so that I can talk about what it all means, really. This sky is 6 of these little vortex flames lit by a center one. The energy comes in at the initial B and goes out with that final Z. They fit together to form a big Aleph, which is like the spin axis. This is the only corner that has spin symmetry. If I tried to rotate it about any other point, it wouldn't have the same full symmetry. This has symmetry. So it's as if there really is a vector going through the middle. There really is a spin axis going through the middle. And that's defined by that giant Aleph. That's the 7th Aleph. That's the day of rest. There's an A on every one of the vortexes. And then there's a capital A, a big A, down the middle. Well, if I lift off one of the vortexes and look at it, you'll notice something about it. It looks different from every way I hold it. Every way I can hold this vortex, it has a different shadow. Here's a more accurately made one. I'll tell you what the shape is supposed to represent. Colors of the 7-color map. Did the ancients have the 7-color map? Did they know the 7-color map theorem? Not necessarily, but they wouldn't have had to. It's the same order of coloring as you see in a rainbow. A rainbow is nothing but the sun is up here and you're standing here, an arc in the sky with red to violet spectrum on it also. And those are the colors of the spectrum. Why 7? Well, there are a lot of other ways they could have come upon the 7 as being intrinsic to this without having to know the 7-color map theorem in our form. But it turns out that when you look at this object from various different perspectives, what you see are the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Also the letters of the Arabic alphabet, and in a related form, the double vortex, the Greek letters. I think you see an A there. Now you'll see an Aleph. So what we have here, these 2 columns, are actual shadowgrams of this model. What I did is I took the model, pointed my TV camera at it, and brought it up on a TV screen, and made a tracing of it, and then I photoreduced it. So those are very accurate. And they're all there, and most of them are pretty good. It's not very convincing, because they aren't necessarily in alphabetical order, and that's important. We haven't done that yet. We need to do that on the computer, although it is possible to peel off a third of the alphabet in alphabetical order by going around the figure. But let me tell you what all this amounts to and why it should be the basis of a religious tradition. What we have here is what I'm calling a geometric metaphor for spiritual transcendence. What the ancients seem to have done is they seem to have come up with a sequence of geometric objects that represents an embryonic process, represents the way a seed blossoms into a flower until it throws off a new seed. The idea is that these objects are parts of this embryonic process. And there's 2 parts to each object. There is a structural part, a framework, like the seed, like a shell, like the husk, and there is an unfolding part, like the tree itself. You know, where did this come from? How did this all happen? How did they do it? What did it mean to them? If you want to make an alphabet, you want to make a language, a technical alphabet, which maybe have later been adopted for phonetic use, that's going to be based on life, then there's one most important characteristic of a living system, of anything that's alive, and that is that it propagates. Oak trees grow from acorns, acorn, oak tree forever, chicken and egg forever. Life is an infinite recursive chain. It extends forever. You could start with a little seed, and a tree always grows from it, and it throws off another seed, and another tree grows, and another seed, and another tree grows. And all these trees are reaching for the sun up on top, and they're all rooted in the earth, and this chain extends conceptually forever. As a matter of fact, the idea of the one God can be understood in this sense. If you want to know where God is, you can look into the tip of an acorn, conceptually, and down through the acorn into its oak tree, and down through the oak tree into its acorn, all the way back to creation. And that would be the right direction to look. And that's what's being modeled here. I want to read you a quotation from the introduction to the Zohar, which is one of the chief works in the Kabbalistic tradition. And this is the very beginning of it. This is the introduction. It's called The Lily. It says, the students of Rabbi Shimon were assembled together, sitting in silence, waiting for the master to begin his discourse. At length, Rabbi Shimon spoke and said, as a lily among the thorns. This lily, what does it symbolize? It symbolizes the congregation of Israel. The lily has 13 leaves surrounding it on all sides. What in the world does that mean? For this reason, the lily symbolizes the cup of blessing, as there are 5 words between the second and third Elohim mentioned in the book of Genesis, as a God name. One of these words is Ur, meaning light. This light was treated and became enclosed as an embryo in the covenant. And entering into the lily as a principle of life made it fruitful. And this is what is called in Scripture fruit tree, yielding fruit, whose seed is in itself. And as this life principle entering into the covenant caused itself to become manifested in 42 kinds of second matter, so it has produced the 42-letter name of God. What has this got to do with anything? Well, let me identify this object for you. Told you it was like a menorah. It's also like many other things that have been mentioned in sacred literature. It's got a globular top to it. It's got a stem. It's sort of twisted up. Might be the Gordian knot cut by Alexander's sword. Or maybe it's the Grail cup cut by the sword of Longinus. I think it might very well be. It sits symmetrically inside this object. You see, every vortex could be on a square face, and every corner would be on a triangular face. And this object, Buckminster Fuller's vector equilibrium, has 12 spheres, 12 corners to it, and there's room in the middle for a center sphere. It's like a 13-petaled rose. And the lily, this is a field of lilies. After all, if you were to look at a calla lily, it looks sort of like a calla lily, another name for this object. It would be growing through this framework, and that's what I'm showing over here, that there is a framework, a structure, this 13-petaled rose, and through it grow these vortices, these calla lilies, these flowers, these flames. Between the center sphere and the sphere of sphere, there is this field of lilies, sort of like little wavicles, little photons between different orbital levels of an electron, wave-particle duality. And so this object seems to fit the beginning descriptions. What are the 42? Turns out if you were to pack 12 little spheres around a center sphere, taking 13, if you would make another layer, if you were to keep opening up the system, layer by layer by layer, the next layer would have 42 spheres. It's the only geometric object that has that quality of 1 surrounded by 12 surrounded by 42. So it's clearly what is being discussed. And it's an embryonic process because it's showing how a seed unfurls into this whole system and then starts over again. And I want to start from one other place to give you an idea of how this fits together, because I want to say some more about the language and what its meaning might be and how we're deriving it. And I think we're beginning to have a time problem anyway. Let's talk about sort of creation. In physics these days, creation starts with the false vacuum, and then the forces sort of settle out of it. You get gravitation, you get the strong force, and you get eventually the electroweak force and electricity, and etc. If you start with a universe that is an infinite sea of cosmic jello, uniform in all directions, transparent, you try to make a distinction in it. This first distinction between inside and outside would be nice. You can't do it easily. If you carve a balloon out of jello in a sea of jello, and that's full of jello, because that's all there is, you haven't got any distinction. It's just jello. But if you do something, anything, any disturbance in the sea of jello, compared to what was there before, it would be an infinite disturbance. Poof. Fiat lux. When you go poof in the jello starts to fall through itself. It forms a smoke ring. Blow a little smoke ring in the air. And the smoke ring falls through itself. It's the lowest order self-referential form. And it separates what's outside of the smoke ring from what's inside the smoke ring. And you can always detect the smoke ring by virtue of the fact that the smoke is circulating. It's this dynamic quality that enables you to make a distinction. And so the smoke ring is the lowest order self-referential form. It's a topology of falling through itself. Ezekiel calls it a wheel of wheels. And it takes 7 colors to map this smoke ring. Now, in order to produce a self-referential system like this, it turns out mathematically you need 4 logical points, 4 logical states. And I don't think we can go into details on that, but if you want to know why there is a 4 cycle required to make a 7 cycle, I would recommend the works of Arthur Young, Reflexive Universe, and many others. 4 logical states form a logical structure, like a tetrahedron. Here's a little tetrahedron with 4 orange logical states. And the tetrahedron, most people think of as having only 4 spin axes of spin symmetry. But in fact, if you also look through the middle of the tetrahedron, from edge to edge, you can rotate it on 3 more axes, which is what these are. The 4 yellow axes are axes of spin symmetry, and symmetry is the important thing to physicists. And also, you've got 3 additional axes, these purple ones, that you can also rotate the figure through. So you can think of a tetrahedron as a radial pack of 7 vectors, and you can think of a vortex, a donut, as a cyclical array of 7 vectors chasing each other. This one is structural. This one is structural, this one is like process. This is like the acorn, and this is like the oak tree. And they co-define each other. The circulation through the axle is defined by the explosion of that point into the ring of 3 points. And the circulation around the tire tread is the cyclic circulation of the 3 points on top. This one can't be compressed, and this one can't fly apart as long as the dissipative flux flows through it. This one is cyclic, this one is structural. And so we end up with, if I can find the right chart, right in front of me here, a kind of mixture of these 2 objects, which are related to each other, the tetrahedron and the vortex. They both are 7 objects, but they're arrayed differently. I could search for the quote, but I think because time is fleeting, I'll just tell you. The Kabbalistic tradition teaches that unity, which is identified with God, exists when the flame is wedded to the coal. Another phrase that shows up in the Old Testament a lot is the so-called light in the meeting tent, tent of communion. If you think about it, these 2 objects are just about the most archetypal objects you could ever come up with. I don't know of any child that hasn't stared into a candle flame that's flickering. And just about every tradition considers that flickering flame to be somehow comparable to consciousness. Light and consciousness are identified with each other. Again, Arthur Young talks about how a photon has choice of what direction it comes off in, and that corresponds to conscious choice. It's the unit of action, the quantum of action in physics. And most folks, particularly in the olden time, used to cook their food around a tripod of sticks called a campfire, or spend the night in a pup tent or tent. So a little tetrahedral tent and a little flame are common to all of our consciousness in all traditions. And they can be understood as having these kind of dual qualities, these qualities of lack of symmetry. Every way you look at this figure, it looks different. There are an infinite number of views. And this figure, which has extreme symmetry. Tetrahedron has really extreme symmetry. Now, I could also use a cube, but the lowest order, the most elegant object of symmetry is the tetrahedron. So that's the universal, the one to pick. There is an oracle talked about in Mosaic times called the Urim and the Thummim, also mentioned by the Mormons, is used to translate their golden plates. No one knows what they are. They're supposed to be something related to the 12 jewels on the breastplate of the high priest, whatever that might mean. If you had a solid tetrahedron, of course, and you looked inside of it, you'd see 3 reflections on each of the 4 faces, and so there would be like 12 jewels, 12 sparkling ways to look at it. And that was used as an oracle to interpret the text. In the Greek traditions, the oracle at Delphi,
To interpret what text?
the Torah text, the Genesis text. There were other uses too. It was also used just as an oracle.
Just the first paragraph or more than the first?
The whole thing. The oracle at Delphi you sat on a tripod, or the oracle sat on a tripod, and around the tripod was Python the snake. Well, here's Python. And so the oracle at Delphi takes the same form, the same geometric metaphor. And again, I'm saying that this is basically, this is the consciousness, this is the mind, this is body, this is yin, this is yang, this is feminine and masculine, wave and particle, analog and discrete. It also looks like a root, a dragon, a serpent. The tetrahedron is related to a vessel or a shell or a nut in metaphorical use in the texts. When one plugs these meanings, which I'm going to tell you about in more detail, into the Kabbalistic texts, they don't read like poetry anymore. They read much more like Euclid, like a very logical geometrical system. I'll give you an example. If I can find it quickly. Maybe I can't find it quickly, so I'm not going to bother with that. Well, here's an interesting example. This is from Gregory Vlastos's book called Plato's Universe, where he talks about Plato considering that the fiery part of the wick would therefore consist of a string of tetrahedra. The flame and the tetrahedra are thought of as being together in the Greek tradition as well as in the Hebrew. Let's see if I can find some. All right, let's let that go. By the way, the alphabets here are rabbinic alphabets from the Islamic period in Spain. And that's also the same period where the Arabic letters match the form, too. I think that the so-called sacred forms on top are stylizations of these that had to be added when the model was lost to maintain distinctions between letters that would otherwise look very much alike. That you couldn't distinguish between certain letters without the model, and so that they had to have these stylizations. But look, there's something peculiar about all these letters. There are decorations on 9 of the letters, which I've indicated in purple, called tagine, crownlets. They come in little triple crownlets. If you take the form that the first verse of Genesis makes, and since it has these 3 ears on it, you can see it a little better here where I've colored them 3 different colors. There's this 13-petal rose, cube octahedron, vector equilibrium in the middle, and there's a vortex coming out of each face. and each of the three are different. You can start out, they sort of start out as these little loops. What are they? How does this really happen? Well, here's our tetrahedron. Here's our seed. This is the lowest order symmetrical object in 3 dimensions. Tetrahedron is what happens when you take a line and you pull it apart and rotate it at the same time. So you have the 2 corners, my 2 fists and my 2 elbows make the tetrahedron, make the corners of the tetrahedron. This way and this way, here to here. And so if you trace the fact that these opposite edges are rotating against each other and follow that rotation and link them up, you get this propeller shape. And that's where it comes from. Now, how do we get from here to here? Well, what you have to realize is that both of these systems of forms expand at the same time. The tetrahedron becomes these other platonic solids, regular and semi-regular solids, and the vortex forms unfurl with it. It's sort of like a flower unfurling. If you take a tetrahedron and you just extend its corners a little bit, bringing it up into a higher dimensional state, and you keep doing that. Here I've extended the corners and I put little edges on them. And then this orange tetrahedron becomes very small. The Kabbalah says the arms of the universe extend to infinity, so we make the diagonal directions very long. There's 12 of them. End up with this form. This is what I'm doing up here. Do you believe that that's a tetrahedron? And as that unfurls, it becomes this form. You see how it fits? The triangular faces are the triangles. These bifurcated edges become the square faces. And so the tetrahedron literally grows into the cube octahedron. The cube octahedron, as Fuller points out, jitterbugs. By itself, it comes up from the octahedron to the icosahedron. And this is a kind of vorticular motion in itself. So as the platonic solids unfurl, the flame unfurls. And then if we put the alphabet on the form that the first verse draws, and this is going to get interesting now. We've got a text that folds itself up into an object. It's written in an alphabet. The alphabet has decorations on it. We put the alphabet on the form that the first verse makes in alphabetical order, just following it around in alphabetical order. These little decorations line up in the corners. There is 1 decoration on one corner, there are 2 on the next, 3 on the third, and then there's 0 opposite 3 on the remaining corner. They specify a tetrahedral coordinate system. 1, 2, 3, and a spin axis. It tells you how to hold the figure. You need to know how to hold it if you're going to make letters from it. It's taught that these decorations somehow contain the secret of redeeming the alphabet, and no one knows what they're there for. And I don't know of any other arrangement that shows what their meaning might be. And the thing is, they look just like the corners of the tetrahedron actually looks. Not only that, but if there really were little spheres on these corner points, then the little decorations would look precisely as they're drawn. 3 little points with a sphere on each corner. And so the decorations really do redeem the alphabet by creating the coordinate system that tells you how you can make the alphabet. And so here we have a text that folds itself up into a form that casts shadows, which are the letters that the text is written in. I would call that self-referential. I would call that self-embedded. And self-referential, self-awareness is what distinguishes us from the other animals. It's self-aware creatures that we're attempting to communicate with. When the Bible says that we are made in the image of God, it doesn't mean, except for a few religious sects, which I hope I'm not insulting, it doesn't mean that we look like God. Most people don't think God looks like me. Right? You all agree to that, don't you? Okay. Maybe Johnny Carson, maybe George Burns, but not me. No, the image is that we are self-aware, and we presume God is self-aware. We presume folks living in outer space are self-aware. Some of the higher animals are self-aware. Koko the gorilla certainly seems to be self-aware. Some of the elephants and dolphins and gorillas are likely to be self-aware. We would like to build an artificial intelligence like R2-D2 or C-3PO that would be self-aware. This is a universal language for self-aware creatures, because self-awareness is also the study of oneself. If you have a society of self-aware creatures, they will by definition study themselves, and the people who study themselves in the society are called philosophers, and the philosophers will study philosophers who study philosophers who study philosophers. And that infinite recursive chain of philosophers who study philosophers is the same chain as the chain of acorns and oak trees going on forever. And so whether you're looking at the self-propagating quality of living systems or the self-aware quality of the creatures who are looking at the self-propagating quality of living systems, you get the same form, a self-organizing form. What does it organize itself into? Well, let's take a couple of these guys and let them self-organize by pairing them off. You pair them off, you get what look like little animal heads. And there are 4 of them, if I don't drop them. And what do they represent? Now this is where we're going to get interesting. Oh, by the way, I was giving this talk in Jerusalem a couple of years ago, actually an earlier version of it, and a rabbi got up and he was quite agitated. He said, do you mean to tell me that Rabbi Nachmanides in the 11th century in Portugal had your model in front of him when he made up the alphabet he wrote in? He said, well, as a matter of fact, there is one object that one can expect rabbis to have. So I held up the little ram's horn. Well, you know, I mean, what can you say? Let's go a little further. If you look up the word Apollo in your dictionary, you'll find it means apollon. A means not, and pollon is cognate to our word full. PL or P and F are the same. Full meaning many. Apollon meaning not many, meaning one, a monad, a unit, their one God. Apollo is said to be the archer of the sun. Well, the center point, be it here or here, is called Shemesh, the sun god in Babylonian. Shamash, the lighting candle in Hebrew, the candle that lights the menorah. If one were to also check Robert Graves, one would find that Apollo also meant, I'm looking for a model, which is evading my face at the moment, also means apple. If one slices Apollo, cognate to apple. If one slices through the middle of an apple, one finds a star of seeds in the middle, surrounded by the peeled apple skin. This is the star and crescent of Islam. This is the sign of the covenant, the bow in the sky. The sky is the star, the bow is around it. Apollo is called the archer of the sun, and he's an apple. Well, here's an apple. If I spin it, maybe you can see that this is peeled off of an apple. And there's the star of seeds in the middle. And from the stem to the flower end of the apple, there is a spin symmetry axis down the middle of the apple, which is also the form of a 2 torus. A fruit is the fruition of the embryonic process, after all. And if one looks down the middle of the apple, the spin axis goes through the sun. This is an apple. Apollo is the archer of the sun. If you look through any of these figures down the middle, you'll also see a heart shape that the arrow pierces. So we have an apple with a heart in the middle, pierced by an arrow or a sword. Happy Valentine's Day. No one knows where the heart symbol comes from, by the way. Now, if you think this is fanciful, it's a little book by a mathematician from, I think, Cambridge or Oxford or some such place, called Field of Form, where he talks about generating the shape of all kinds of fruit, all kinds of buds, and more buds, and also the heart muscle in 7 wound layers, all in an invariant tetrahedron. In other words, the parameters of generating these budding forms all can be determined from an invariant tetrahedron. So there really is a tetrahedron or a cube, which is a double tetrahedron. Here's a double tetrahedron. 2 tetrahedrons through each other forms a cube around an apple or around the fruit. And so we have a model of a seed with a little DNA inside, if you'd like, and it grows into a fruit, which has a seed inside of it. Remember, the Zohar says, fruit tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself. And so this is a model of the fruition of that seed. It's what it grows into. And it's identified with Valentine's heart, with William Tell's apple, if you'd like, with Apollo. If you look at one section of this, it's Chrisman. It's a symbol identifying Christ in Christian tradition. If you look at the most common stained glass window, so-called rose window, occurs in synagogues and churches and in mosques. Most people assume that these yellow leaves are the leaves of the 6-sided Shushan flower. Shushan is the name of the 6-sided flower. And this is flat. But in fact, what's really going on is you've got a cube with a vortex on each face, and you're looking down the tip of it. And so that's the shadow of this. Think of each of the vortices as these guys. And there's, of course, 6. And they're 1 each on each face of the 6 faces of the cube. So this very common drawing in all traditions is really just a 2-dimensional projection of this apple, this Grail cup, this Philosopher's Stone, this Gordian knot, this apple, this Apollo apple. Now this center point, this is Apollo, the pagan sun god, to the peasantry in Greece. But the philosophers, they recognized that that sun center was not an ordinary sun center. Their calling it a god would have been like our calling it a fountain. I have some quotes on that too, which I don't think I have time to get to. It's a recursive fountain. It's again looking into this acorn, into the oak tree, into the acorn, into the oak tree, into the acorn, all the way back to the sun or to God, depending on the metaphor you're using. Sun being a metaphor for God. The sun thought of as an event horizon, like an acorn is. I'll show you a little cute thing here to the sheet. So I didn't bring any of the Greek letters along, but if you recognize that that's the same as the Hebrew letter B, you'll recognize that as the Greek letter B. All right, let me sum some of this up, and I want to get to one main point, because otherwise I'm going to not be able to finish it. All of the things on this table are one model. They all unfurl from each other. They map an embryonic process. What does this have to do with consciousness? Well, let's pick up the little letter again. This is the element that generates the letters. I could use this as a kind of pointer, you see. I could point any direction I wanted to with this, as if I had a shaft down the spin axis, and it was a little arrowhead. If I was standing on the globe of the Earth and walking around, and this was me, my consciousness, my life that was modeled by this flame, then my feet to my head direction would point in all kinds of directions in 3 dimensions. And then I could rotate and look in any number of directions from any position. Well, every time I did that, if you were looking at me, you'd see a different letter. The letters represent perspectives of this object as you move around it. Then what's a sacred text consisting of a string of these letters? It's kind of the directions for following a kind of path, step by step. Each letter rotates you, or rotates this object in your mind's eye. I'll read you a couple of quotations here. This one is from an old Science News where Dietrich Thomson is reporting on a conference in quantum theory and gravitation. They're searching for a universal language for physics, and they end up suggesting that Clifford algebra should be used as a universal language for physics because it's a language of manipulation and directions, called spinors, really, in physics. Little unit directions, little unit spins in hyperspace, elements of Einsteinian space-time. Here's another quote, another diagram, actually. Sorry. This is from Robert John and Brenda Dunn's book on quantum mechanics of consciousness, where they're talking about mapping points of conscious focus on a, basically, on a spherical coordinate system. I believe that, understood appropriately, this little object and these letters represent directions in space-time and directions in conscious focus. And to be taken on a little trip of one to another point of conscious focus is to be taken on a little internal meditative dance, a little yogic path. If that sequence led to a transcendental experience, then that would be a sacred text. If one had a yogic dance or a mental exercise, a meditation that one wanted to record for posterity, that if one could perform it would produce an initiatory, a baptismal, a near-death, an out-of-body experience, whatever you want to call it, then this would be a way to record that. Now, I can't show that that's what really happened here. Until we can identify a particular direction with each letter and do it analytically, obviously in computer simulation, we can't reconstruct the path, so we can't verify if this is true. But there's a lot of evidence that something like this is going on. So that's sort of the significance of this. Both mathematicians and meditating rabbis report that if you turn over a hyperdimensional object or a three-dimensional object in a hyperdimensional space in your mind, that is the equivalent of a meditative experience that does evoke an experience. And so it looks like this geometric metaphor, if you can understand it, if you can follow it, if you can allow these forms to blossom in your own mind, if you can look at these views of the flame, which I don't know how many of you looking at these sequence of shapes would realize they were all shadows of one object. But if you can interpolate in your mind the intermediate shape between these two, if you can rotate this in your mind's eye, you can do that meditation, then you might have an experience. And I would suggest people try it. I can't tell you what will happen with you. I know that these are powerful and evocative figures for me. That's where they came from. Let me look at my notes and see if there's anything I really wanted to say, because I can see we're running out of time. Maybe I should go over these drawings a little more, cover anything I didn't. Yeah, let me just make a few quick points. In the Kabbalistic tradition, they say that there are three letters that are mother letters, and they never give a reason. It's in Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Formation. They say the letters are Aleph, Mem, and Shin, A, M, and S. The only letters adjacent to the center point in the Genesis pattern are this Aleph, these two Alephs, this S, and this M, which could be slid in. And so this figure validates the Kabbalistic discussion of the three mother letters. This is how a tetrahedron would unfurl fractally. And that's what's really going on here. It's like any other living system. It keeps propagating on itself. So not only does this little tetrahedron make 4 tetrahedra, but each of these makes more. And it keeps growing. And again, it would be lovely to do that on a computer sometime. Oh, I wanted to mention this. These 12 points, 12 spheres that surround this 13-petaled rose that this Shushan flower grows through. By the way, now we know why the first word is translated bara sheet. Created 6, or created a thorn. Here are the 6, and there was the thorn. This is a unifying model. The divergent translations to the first verse, if you have these models, all mean the same thing. The war the academic scholars have between Apollo meaning an apple and Apollo meaning not many is resolved by the one apple. The model satisfies both discussions. Let me think if there's anything else. Oh, I did want to do these. If you take the little vortex forms and you double them up, This is a mirror image. And remember, there's 7 principal views. You have what looks to this non-expert as 7 postures corresponding to 7 chakras. Those are like yogic meditation postures. They look a little like a yogi sitting there meditating. I don't know, that guy's levitating already. This has just been touching the surface. I'm really feeling a little bit like I've bitten off more than I could chew here because I haven't been able to show you everything. Oh, wait, this is important. This is important. I started to show you how these guys self-organized. They fit together. They can obviously be clustered together to form these ball-shaped objects. By the way, this is interesting to mention too, one of them looks like an apple. You see the stem? See the globe? The apple? The other one is kind of a flatted sphere. I call it a fig. Fig and apple. When one becomes self-aware, one puts on the fig leaf. The word fig in Hebrew is cognate to the word I am. It's the fruit of the tree, of the I am tree, the tree of self-awareness. Except if one attempts to line up the little decorations on the apple, they come out 2, 2, 2, an indistinct, unusable coordinate system. On the fig, 1, 2, 3. The fig generates, continues to propagate. The apple dies off. That, I believe, is why the apple is associated with evil, because it is a dead-end path mathematically. After the bifurcation into these 2 forms, one dies off and the other continues to propagate. The living one is the fig shape. So it explains why apples have a bad name. By the way, you can consider the vortex to be the serpent in the apple, if you like. The other thing that these things fit together to form, if one connects them in a long chain, is DNA. Buckminster Fuller's tetrahelix model of DNA. The interesting thing is that there are 22 faces to one module of DNA. The old Canaanite alphabet had 22 letters. There are 27 symmetry elements to the globular form. The new alphabet has 27 letters. The conversion between the old and new alphabet, which would have been unthinkable if the alphabets were different, is legitimate because the 2 alphabets, are transformations of each other. In fact, it may turn out that they correspond to the 27 lines on the general cubic surface and the 21 vertices and the center point. Maybe not, but it seems intriguing. Well, I've got some people who know a little more math than I am trying to help me figure that if that's legitimate. Let's see, maybe I should let people ask questions, because I really don't know how far I've gotten with this. I sort of got lost. And we could also turn this on and make it look pretty if we turn the lights out. Questions? Well, the applications with the applications. This is a self-organizing system. I didn't get to discuss it. There are applications potentially for self-organizing systems in artificial intelligence. These geometric models are common to the various religious faiths that are at one time or another at war with each other. I think it would help people to respect each other if they realized that the models were common. Geometric metaphor is currently unrecognized in the Talmud. It's unrecognized in the Kabbalistic tradition. Most of the translators of Kabbalistic material take it to be just pure meditational directions or just poetry. They don't take seriously the descriptions. You plug these objects in and they make sense. For instance, in Sefer Yetzirah, they talk about a law of 3, 7, and 12, and they relate it to Tali, the dragon, Galgal, the wheel, and Labi, the heart. Well, the dragon is a line form, and it has 3 aspects to it. The wheel, Galgal, Gimel Lamed, cognate to our letters CL, CL, coil, coil. A double coil, a wheel of wheels. It's a 7 object. And the heart down the middle. There's also a heart on this form too, if you look through it. See the heart shape, front to back. Sits inside of a 12 symmetry object. So the fanciful description, 3, 7, and 12, a dragon, a wheel, and a heart, just poetry to the ordinary translation. If you plug in these models, then it makes sense as a line, a surface, and a volume. Okay, questions again.
You start with the tetrahedron and move to, that gives rise to these forms. At least one of which, I guess the icosahedron is one of the 5 platonic solids. And what I understood of the 5 platonic solids, you start with the tetrahedron and...
This is not a platonic solid, this is an Archimedean solid, it's a semi-regular.
Okay.
It's squares and triangular faces. But go ahead, continue.
Well, there's the 5 platonic solids, if you draw the vortices out, they each give rise to the next one and generates the next one.
Right.
And the last one goes back to the seed form. And I was just wondering, are these two things parallel? Are they different from each other?
The seed and the flower, you mean?
Well,
Or-
the
icosahedron is-
generation you have here, it doesn't include the dodecahedron.
No, in fact, the dodecahedron is a kind of spin of 5 spheres, 5 cubes. In other words, a dodecahedron can be thought of as 5 cubes that are sort of nested together. And the first verse... In fact, that may be what's going to enable it to sort out those points that aren't covered yet, is that there's denser packing. I just couldn't have drawn it that way, it would have been gibberish. So, and that just represents the dodecahedron. It isn't the dodecahedron the way I'm drawing it. The icosahedron is the closest packing of 12 spheres without a central sphere. The cuboctahedron has room for the central sphere. That's why it surrounds the lily on all sides. It surrounds it on the inside and outside. But that's where we started for. That's what Vegas. The heavens and the earth, inside and outside.
You talked about verse 1 folding up into that object, by some symmetry. What about verse 2?
I didn't, I mentioned it earlier, I didn't, I have it in my notes here, it's just much too long. Verse 2 is lots more letters and makes a very big, complicated
But
pattern.
it doesn't fold up into that same pattern.
It folds up in, well, I can't be sure because it's too long to really twist it all down, but it folds up into a pattern that maps on this pattern. In other words, they're basically, instead of there being just 7 turns, I believe there's 21 turns in 8-fold symmetry.
And
I can show it to you
third
afterwards,
verse
if you'd like.
also, and the fourth
This
verse?
is the 3rd verse. And again, you can see how the letters pair up. I've looked at the first week, and it gets complicated very quickly. The elements of this pattern continue, but I can't show the pattern explicitly beyond the first few days. I've looked into the text, and I've found markers that indicate the patterns continue as far as about 2,000 letters in. And then there's other statistical work that confirms that there are other patterns that permeate the text, which I haven't done any work on that. But there's lots of indications the patterns do continue. I've also correlated, there's a Hasidic rabbi staying with us in December, and he insisted that I check the last verse of Deuteronomy. And I said, what does that have to do with Genesis? He said, well, there's a rabbinic teaching that the end of the Torah connects to the beginning of the Torah. So I said, all right, I'll check. It correlates on the same form. Don't ask me how. Deuteronomy was written, according to the scholars, 1,000 years after Genesis. Please.
On your archetypes of the light and the tent,
Yeah.
I believe you mentioned that a cube could also be used instead of the tetrahedron. Have you noticed any specific advantages, like any specific instance where you'd want to use a cube rather than the tetrahedron?
I'm using a tetrahedron because I believe that's the primary model, and because the symmetries of the tetrahedron are the same as the symmetries of a cube or an octahedron. And since it's the lowest order form, it's the one most likely to be the universally chosen one because it's the unique lowest order form. But in other cultures, in various cultures at various times, different ways of understanding this took priority. The Hebrews may have used the ram's horn to model the shape of the vortex because it was a sacred object in their tradition. Christians might have used the bell. It's also a vortex form. Maybe we have a horn of this form. Maybe there's, I mean, the Greeks seem to have used a double vortex in the form of an apple. By the way, this is the first form that functions as a donut. Remember, the quality of this donut is that it falls through itself. Well, if you try to make a tetrahedral, a polyhedral frame pull through itself, you can't do it until you get up to the cuboctahedron. The cuboctahedron can pull through itself. See, this is a frame. This is the apple is the monad of wholeness. A donut is flat. It's a mathematically ideal because it's two circular cross sections, but it's not the lowest order form in the real world. in the real world, the one that has this embryonic quality of having a sphere surrounded by a sphere of spheres, which can fractally unfold like an unfurling wavefront endlessly, you need the cube octahedron.
If one is conscious enough to be a witness to themselves and observe themselves the way these objects are self-referential, how does the fact that that watching affects what is being watched change these objects? Or affect
Well, they make them alive for you if you bring them into your consciousness. I mean, I can't do that. I can only propose that this was a way of reaching a transcendental understanding for some people in the ancient world. It's very important to mention, for instance, I don't know how many of you are aware of the work of Ernest G. McLean, Pythagorean Plato, The Myth of Invariance, Meditations Through the Koran. He's a musicologist at Brooklyn College. I guess he's elderly now. And he's done very similar things to this entirely in musical metaphor. And the reason it works is because the Greek double octave maps on to the double cycle. And so whatever you've done, whatever I've shown you geometrically, you could also produce musically. But it's how you internalize it. I can't make it real. No one should believe me about transcendence. You got to try it. I mean, no, you can't believe anybody else about that. If you know it's ego death, it isn't ego death. Right? It's a problem there.
On the musical question, do each of the letters have a sound?
Yes.
Because a lot of the ways to transform is with sound, and
We have a musical version of the text that we played out simply by assigning notes to each letter and going up the scale in alphabetical order, and the text is very evocative when you do that. But I don't think that's the right sound. We'd have to determine the sound of each letter. What I would propose to do is to take these shadowgrams and treat them like little graphs and run a Fourier transform on them to find their harmonic components, and then see if that made sense as a kind of sound for each letter. Because see, then when you heard the sound, that would produce a point of conscious focus in your mind too. I mean, sound connects to feeling very directly. Also, these texts are all chanted. People don't read, observant Jews don't read the Torah on a weekly. They read the Torah through every year, week by week. They sing it. The singing is primary, not the speaking of it.
Is there a set melody or something?
There is now, but it's not clear how far back it goes. Also, there were hand gestures that used to go with it, which are lost, except that some of the Yemenite Jews know the hand gestures, but there's only a few thousand left. So it's not obvious. They've never been written down.
If you could build an ideal model for this, animated 3 dimensions at
Yeah.
least, what basically would it look like would come these shapes? Would you?
Well, what does a hypersphere look like, or a hypercube?
Yeah, I mean, how would you put it in computer graphics?
It
animation?
doesn't look like anything. It's a feeling.
So your feelings would best if it was generated by your feelings. Then.
Let me give you an example. Let's say there were creatures living in flatland, two-dimensional reality, and we looked down on them. As far as they're concerned, we'd be God. We could see their whole world in a glance. We could see inside of their bodies. If we wanted to talk to the Flatlanders, what would we say to them, and how could we say it? Well,
You have to somehow hang out there for a while.
we don't fit in Flatland, and they don't know about 3 dimensions.
Well, conceptually, I guess.
Well, what's the most important thing to say to a Flatlander? Anybody want to guess?
Hi.
Well, that's right. Edwin Abbott actually proposes this question in his book, Flatland. What is it? Anybody remember? What's the question you ask a Flatlander? What's the most important thing to tell a Flatlander?
what direction are we heading?
Sort of. Hello, look up. There's an infinitely greater universe transcendent to your own. Just like what God would like to tell us. Assuming there's a God. I mean, after all, what's the most important thing? How does God prove himself? Well, think about it. What could the Flatlander, what could we do to communicate with a to transmit this message? Saying it wouldn't do any good. Who would believe it? If God tapped you on the shoulder and say, "Hey, I'm God," would you believe him? Nobody else seems to.
Maybe
I mean, we've had that situation. People don't believe it.
Maybe you saved their lives in some mysterious way.
Well, I'll tell you one way.
Lived
If
the
you projected onto Flatland a hologram of a 3-dimensional scene, Flatlander couldn't see it, of course, because he'd have to get out of Flatland and shine his laser reference beam on it in order to see it. So that wouldn't work. But what if the Flatlander were to rhythmically traverse the pattern on the surface of his flatland, day by day and year by year for a lifetime, building up on his cortex a model of the higher dimensional pattern, and then in a flash, maybe by a trauma, he gets hit on the head, maybe he's meditating, maybe he takes some interesting chemicals, whatever. Maybe he just goes into alpha. He would read out in a glance, in a Kundalini stroke, he would get a glimpse of three space, and then he'd believe. Well, these texts are rhythmically chanted day by day and year by year by Orthodox Jews for the last 2,500 years anyway.
So the feeling of transcendence and the feeling of creation are pretty...
It's the feeling. It snaps into place when you grok it, when you sense it. This is a living system, yes.
What dimensionality do you figure it is?
I think we're looking at a fractal pattern that stretches from 3 dimensions where we are and reaches towards 4 dimensions. And when it gets to 4 dimensions, it starts over again in the point and unfurls again. I think we're looking at an embedded recursive system where you go from 0-dimensional seed point, which has an intrinsic spin to it, an intrinsic spin in the seed point. Where's my, here they are. See, this is a sphere point. Think of the tetrahedron defines a sphere. That's what defines a ball. And then there's this intrinsic spinningness. It's like a pregnant point. And it sort of bootstraps itself, corkscrews its way into 1 dimension. The seed sprouts a 1-dimensional line stem. And the line stem, at the top of a little sprout, there is a pair of leaves forming a surface. And then within those leaves, eventually a bud comes up, a volume. And then from the bud, a flower blossoms. And the flower gets all crenellated, all bent over on itself, because it doesn't quite fit in 3 dimensions. It overflows 3 dimensions. You know what the most common 4-dimensional object is? We all see it all the time. A fruit is a 4-dimensional object. It is an extrusion of a living thing into our reality. And then, of course, within the fruit is a 0-dimensional seed that starts the process over again.